Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. Well, it's summer now, and I don't know about where you are, but here in the Northeast US, it feels like summer just hit us with a big old hammer about 2 days ago. It's suddenly hot and humid with afternoon thunderstorms. Highs are in the upper 80s and the lower 90s. The air conditioning's on. And instead of being in the basement to hide from the bitter cold and winds, I'm down here hiding from the heat and humidity. At least we have basements here, unlike our friends down south who are dealing with a whole other level of heat and humidity and have nowhere to hide, except maybe in a Walmart and hiding in there hoping the electrical grid can hold up. But yeah, summer here makes me think of summer songs. And there are a few albums that evoke summer more than the one I'm going to talk about now. And I realize I'm doing this at my peril because my last show about this band didn't garner much love. And maybe that's because most of my followers came to me from the r/skinny puppy subreddit. And there maybe isn't that much overlap between puppy people and the fans of this other band. Or maybe it's because this band has done their utmost in the last 15 years to kill any lingering fan base they might have had. I remember various rabid online fan communities that are all but dust these days. I mean, how bad does it have to get to disengage your rabid fans on the internet? Pretty bad, I guess. But I wouldn't know because I stopped listening to anything new from this band 20 years ago. And in my opinion, and I know it's an opinion that the old fan base widely shared, they peaked with this album I'm going to discuss today. And despite, having a handful of albums since, it was their last experience being at the front of the pack. Subsequent decades would find them in an increasingly desperate attempt to follow their own followers. And, on that point, I noticed that it's pro tennis season again. Wimbledon is going on as I speak, and back in the day, I used to follow pro tennis pretty closely. This was back in the days when Pete Sampras and Steffi Graf almost completely owned the sport. And one of the last matches that I really paid attention to involved this young guy named Roger Federer. I mean, whatever happened to him, he probably sank without a trace. But the band I'm talking about today reminds me of an old tennis pro trying to reclaim their glory days. And I remember back in the early 90s when Bjorn Borg attempted a pro comeback. Now, he was unquestionably one of tennis's greats, but he had retired in the early 80s and had been out of it for nearly a decade. Then he grew his hair out again and tried coming back on his own terms using his old wooden racket. Meanwhile, the kids of the day, and pro tennis is still largely a kid's sport, they were dominating the game with these huge oversized graphite rackets, and the game itself had changed. It was less about serve and volley finesse, and it was more about raw power from the baseline. So for several reasons, Borg got his ass handed to him by these kids who cited him as an inspiration, the kids who thought of him as a hero. But he was a has-been, and even when he switched to graphite rackets, he found he couldn't compete. The game had just passed him by. In fact, by staying in the game and attempting his comeback, he was actually threatening his own legacy, because what would people remember? Would they remember him at his peak, or as this pathetic middle-aged guy who couldn't win a pro match, let alone find a tournament seed? So the band I'm talking about now was much like that in the 2000s and beyond. So they were unquestionably one of the greats at one point, had very solid punk and post-punk credentials, but with diminishing returns over the decades. However, all of that would be in the future. I'm talking about 1989 here. And in 1989, the second summer of love, this band was still riding high. They were at a career peak, artistically and commercially. And of course, I'm talking about New Order and their classic album, Technique. So let me talk a little about the first time I heard Technique. Now, I already talked about New Order way back in episode 3, where I discussed their compilation album, Substance. and their original incarnation as Joy Division. And I did another episode just on Joy Division. But Substance was their most commercially successful album, even though it was a singles compilation that had just two new studio tracks, True Faith and 1963. Technique was their first studio album since Brotherhood in 1986. And I'm not sure why Technique has such a strong summer feel to it. Maybe because, well, it was released, let me say, it was released in January 1989, so the middle of winter. But it does have a summer feel, maybe because the parts of it were recorded in Ibiza the summer before. And you might have heard about that trip. It was a pretty notorious trip. Consisted of a lot more partying than actual recording, but it did set kind of a vibe for the album that would follow. And you can read all about that Ibiza experience in Peter Hook's great memoir, Substance Inside New Order, and in Stephen Morris's memoir, Fast Forward. And I think Bernard Sumner also described it in his ghost-written memoir as well. But anyway, you can read about the partying, the carrying on, the road accidents, and exploits with various Happy Mondays and so on. So it was pretty debauched, but it wasn't nearly as debauched as the Mondays' so-called recording sessions in Barbados for what would become their Yes Please album. That's a whole other story. Anyway, I became a pretty hardcore New Order and Joy Division fan in 1990 or so. And I think I talked about that in episode 3. And I started with a dubbed copy of Substance, and it went from there. At some point, I heard the Fine Time single when I borrowed it from a friend, and I think I still have it. Sorry about that. That was my first taste of the material on Technique. So let's talk about the Fine Time single briefly, because it came out in 1988, a few months before the album. Of course, I didn't realize this at the time. I'd only discovered Technique and its singles a year or so after they were released. But Fine Time is a pretty odd song, and I'll get into it more later, but for one thing, it's almost entirely electronic except for very few vocals and for Peter Hook's bass. It sort of had this kind of staggery beat to it and this squiggly synth line that I would eventually realize was taken from Acid House. Now, just a bit of history, Acid House is this whole other genre of techno that revolved around the sounds that one could make by abusing the Roland TB-303 bass synthesizer. And that's a classic example of innovation through equipment abuse. So Roland built the 303 to accompany guitarists who didn't have any friends who could play the bass. Instead, electronic musicians realized they could twiddle the knobs in this thing and create a whole new soundtrack for people who are spaced out on ecstasy. So Acid House was more or less the sound that propelled that summer of 1989, and it drove rave culture, glow lights, happy face t-shirts, baggy clothes, water bottles, and countless dilated eyeballs. Not that I experienced any of that firsthand, because I was still in high school in a very rural part of the United States, and no one around me was popping E's or waking up in a field with a cow nuzzling your head. But that was definitely happening in rural England in 1989, with some ripples spreading over the ocean to the U.S., just not where I was. But you have to hand it to Roland for building the TR-808 and the TB-303. Both of those boxes would change popular music as we knew it, but in ways that their marketing team could never have predicted. So it makes you kind of wonder, what has Roland innovated lately? Probably electronic drums. Their whole V-drum line is pretty innovative, but they still suck live, in my opinion. You just cannot beat acoustic drums live. Anyway, it was clear that Fine Time had some of that hip acid house bass in it. By this point, Peter Hook, who was the bassist in the band, had pretty much given up playing the bass in a traditional way. Instead of playing your normal low root notes like a traditional rock bassist, he played melodically, really up on the neck, much higher octaves with his signature Electro-Harmonix Clone Theory chorus. And sometimes he'd play a six-string bass. He'd play melodies that were more like a baritone guitar than a bass guitar. And he left the actual bass, everything at 100 hertz and below, to the machines to play. And Fine Time was no different. But that was my first taste of Technique, and I don't remember when I got the whole thing. I probably dubbed a cassette off a friend, but soon enough I would buy this CD and I would listen to it pretty much nonstop through 1991 and 1992. So yeah, let's go through this album. It's one of my favorite albums ever. Definitely my favorite New Order studio album. The cover is really cool. Of course, it was done by Peter Saville, who did every New Order cover. Here he's using his so-called dichromat technique that he debuted on the sleeves for True Faith and Touched by the Hand of God. This time he applied it to a photo of a cherub statue, and I don't know what the implication is there. To me, the color choice is pretty psychedelic, maybe a reference to the summer of '88. The inside sleeve repeats this image in a variety of other colors. So here you go. It's pretty trippy. Not much in the way of actual information, though. So little bit of information about the album there, and that's it. So if I recall correctly, Factory Records actually did promote this album, which was something of a novelty for them. They were a pretty unconventional label run by a bunch of people who weren't familiar with common business practices. That's kind of an understatement. One of the things they did for this album, though, was they papered this sleeve all over their headquarters in Manchester. And if I remember correctly, I think they even assigned a catalog number to the advertising campaign. So the Factory Records catalog is pretty interesting. Go out and check that out sometime. There's all sorts of things that have catalog numbers. Anyway, I like that the cover has no words. It's a nice, clean design. And there's the back cover. I like the letter design there. It's interesting. So it's a pretty short album. It has just 9 tracks. This was, back in the days when the album had to comfortably fit on vinyl. And it starts with Fine Time, naturally. Exactly the same mix as the 12-inch single version. And as I said, this is a weird song. It's very kitchen sinky, like they threw in everything that they could and just pinned it all down with a 4 on the floor beat to turn it into a dance tune. There are very few lyrics. What's there mostly pertain to like an age difference between the singer and the girl he's talking to. And if you think about it, Bernard Sumner was 35 or so when he wrote this tune, so he was probably writing from experience. He uses some pitch shifting, so the lyrics are kind of hard to hear in places, but at one point he says, I've met a lot of cool chicks, but I've never met a girl with all her own teeth, which is maybe the third stupidest New Order lyric I've ever heard. But the song ends with samples of sheep, and that might be another reference to raves, or it might just be that Stephen Morris liked to use all the really weird samples in the Emulator's banks. I don't know. He's the guy who played the frogs on The Perfect Kiss, after all. But there are a few, that's a dance song, and there are a few straight up acoustic rock songs in this album. And the next one is one of these. So track 2 is called All the Way, and it blatantly rips off Just Like Heaven from The Cure. It's the same chord progression. All the Way never changes, though, unlike Just Like Heaven, which has a different chorus part. It's a much simpler tune. So word among fans was that New Order ripped off The Cure in retaliation for The Cure ripping off Blue Monday when they did The Walk. But who knows? We may never know the truth because these tracks came out at pretty much the same time. So it's hard to say who stole from who. And I think it was just a good-natured thing between these bands who are both very popular. But All the Way is a nice little song. It's one of my favorites on the album, and it goes right into another acoustic song, which is Love Less, which starts out with Barney coughing for some reason. But this tune is mostly acoustic guitar and drums, and it has a nice little guitar hook, and it's very simple. And I should say that right around this time, when I was 18 or so, my dad had picked up an acoustic guitar for me, and I had never played guitar before. I think he got this thing at a yard sale for $4, if memory serves, and I played the hell out of that thing. It was a little Stella acoustic. I think we still have it knocking around somewhere. It was a really cheap guitar. It didn't have a truss rod in the neck, so eventually the neck bowed so much that it just wasn't playable anymore, and I had to upgrade to a Squier Strat, which was about 1,000,000 times easier to play. But it was fun playing along to technique on that acoustic guitar since so many of the songs were these simple acoustic numbers. And it made me realize how simple some songs really are. And almost anybody can play the songs on this album, even if you don't know much about how to play a guitar. So it kind of got me a foot in the door to becoming a musician. Love Less is just very simple. It has pretty much a verse and a chorus, and just is a pretty little song. And that goes into track 4, which is Round and Round. Now, this was the big dance number, another electronic song. Unfortunately, I didn't realize this at first, but the mix on this album really sucks compared to the single version. There's just no meat on this version at all. It's all synth pads and vocals. But, I didn't know any better, and I naively listened to this thing for years before picking up the 12-inch single. And I remember taking the single home, and the first time I put it on the old hi-fi, and the first thing that hit me was how much more powerful the mix was. I could feel the bass and the drums. It was just a lot tighter, a lot crisper. The drum pattern stood out more. The other thing I noticed on that version was that there was no singing. So I was wondering what was going on, like double checking the sleeve. Am I playing an instrumental or what is this? And what happened was uh, I would later learn that I was playing the 12-inch version. Now, notice that's not the 12-inch mix. That's something completely different. But the 12-inch version has this long extended intro that comes to a brief pause, and then the actual song comes crashing in. And it was just really awesome once that happened and that little break came in, and then the song started, and I realized what was going on. And it was really a cool experience to listen to that for the first time. And it was so much better than the crappy album mix. But yeah, I could swear that the single version even has extra parts that the album version either doesn't have or they're just way buried. All these rhythmic counterpoints that are going on, you just can't hear in the album version. So I feel like the single version of this song was fully realized, and maybe this version on the album was the band's initial attempt at it, but it really doesn't hit that peak the way the single version does. So there was a 7-inch version too. That was just an edit of the 12-inch version without the intro, and that's the version they used in the video, which by this time I had seen on 120 minutes. But I'll talk more about the singles and the videos later. But yeah, for now, the point I just want to make is that this is a really cool track, but only if you have the single versions. The album version sucks. In fact, I would go so far as to say the 12-inch version is easily one of my top 3 New Order tunes of all time. And as a dance tune, it's pretty much flawless. I mean, the lyrics, though, are typically meaningless. This is one of 4 or 5 songs where Barney makes a reference to some girl using him for his money. I guess he was pretty sensitive about that. Again, maybe writing from life. But yeah, the lyrics are dumb, but as the kids say today, it still slaps. This goes into track 5, which is another acoustic-y kind of tune, and maybe my favorite of the bunch. It's called Guilty Partner. This song doesn't quite fit as well as the others on this album. It's a little more fraught, a little less laid back. It manages to kind of squeeze some angst and darkness out of some simple instrumentation, not unlike, an early Cure song might. Steve Morris is laying down a nice drum groove, and Peter Hook playing a pretty interesting melody in the bass. It's all like minor key stuff. There are some synths at the end, so Gillian Gilbert is probably playing guitar on this album. Really cool tune. Like I said, this album as a whole has a very laid-back summer vibe, but this is one song that kicks against that. It provides a little bit of contrast. So then we go into track 6, which is Run. This is another tune that they did that's built on this bass line that just goes from C to F and back again. So it more or less recycles the bass line from Lonesome Tonight, which was a B-side to their Thieves Like Us single. And I think Lonesome Tonight is actually one of their best songs. But Peter Hook said he ripped that bass line off of Emma by Hot Chocolate. So I guess that happened. But on Run, they really take that and kind of tart it up, make the song very poppy. It's definitely poppier than Lonesome Tonight. It's a pretty upbeat track. It has this nice chorus that doesn't have any words to it. It's just guitar and synth. I guess the trouble was it was evidently too close to the melody for John Denver's Leaving on a Jet Plane because he ended up suing the band. And I can actually hear the similarity in the guitar line. There's no question that it's similar. It might not be identical, but it's pretty close. And do I think New Order consciously ripped off John Denver? No, I doubt it. At least with The Cure, they were trading material with a band in the same ballpark, but John Denver was in another world entirely. It just seems to me to be like one of those coincidences. There's only so many notes in the scale, so some melodies are bound to be similar. Anyway, Factory decided to release Run as the third single after Fine Time and Round, but unfortunately, Denver won his lawsuit and they had to limit the number of copies. So, fortunately, I have the 12-inch here, and I'll show you that in a minute. There were even fewer 7-inches that were pressed for promos, but I'll talk about that more when I get to the singles. As a song, Run isn't really my favorite track here. I find that it's just a bit too vanilla. Again, I used to play my guitar to this album all the time, and I remember in college I was playing along to this, and when I played the bit at the end, my roommate sang the lyrics to The Old Gray Mare over it, and it fit perfectly. So maybe whoever wrote The Old Gray Mare should have sued New Order too. It was definitely a missed opportunity there. But that goes into track 7, which is Mr. Disco. And if I remember from either Steven or Peter's memoir, I forget which, this was around the time in 1988 when they started just picking really stupid track titles. And this is one of those. And normally with New Order, the track titles had nothing to do with the lyrics or the song at all. But this tune itself is this peppy little electronic number. And I did a listen back to this album before putting this episode together to try to get my thoughts together. And it just struck me that this is a really cool track. It's maybe one of my favorite tracks on this album. It just sounds great blasting out of a sound system. And in my opinion, it would have made a much better single than Run, which was more or less a rock song, not a dance song, even though they tried to slap some cheesy beats on it. But Mr. Disco for sure would get some club play as a single. It would be no problem. And I actually think it's a better dance track than Fine Time, but maybe not better than Round. But the bass line on this track is really similar to the bass line in State of the Nation, which was a single around the time of Brotherhood, except this bass line's in D instead of E. I also like how this track ends in a big burst of white noise, which was kind of a nice touch. But that goes into track 8, which is Vanishing Point. This song is a pretty seamless blend of electronic and acoustic components. It's one of those New Order songs that has a really long, complicated intro that seems to take days before you hit the first verse. And some of the things I really like about this track, in no particular order, the kick drum is awesome. It doesn't screw around. It's there almost the whole song. I like how it has 2 interlocking piano riffs that together make a much more complicated overall riff. That's just a neat trick. And I especially like Peter Hook's amazing 4-note bass solo in the middle. It's just 4 notes, folks. But I know this song was a fan favorite from back in the days of the old Ceremony mailing list. Cheers to any of my Ceremony friends out there. But I also know that this song was used as a theme for the British TV show Making Out at one point, and that they used a somewhat instrumental version that is actually a B-side in one of my Round singles. But it's a really cool tune. And then we go to the closer, which is Dream Attack. And this is another tune that blends electronic and acoustic really well, but it starts off completely acoustic, just drums and guitar. And I know this was another fan favorite, but it's really not one of my favorites. I'd kind of dump it in there with Love Less, maybe as one of the tunes that just doesn't stand out quite as much for me. I think the most distinctive thing about it is the outro, which is sort of this extended jam that plays for a few minutes and then just sort of fades out. And that's the album. So yeah, just 9 songs. But like I said, that's really just the start. There were a ton of tracks released on the singles from this album in all sorts of formats. it's more or less impossible to collect every edition of each single because it would mean collecting hundreds of releases. So let's talk about it. At a very high level, there were just three singles. There were Fine Time, Round and Round, and this new version of Run they called Run 2. So let's talk about the Fine Time single. The cover is another dichromat, this time with pill capsules. Again, maybe a reference to the acid house and E and everything that was going on at the time. And of course, the track listing depends on which version of the single you have. But generally, there's some mix of 6 basic tracks. So you had your 7-inch and your 12-inch mixes. You had your instrumental mix, which for some reason they called Fine Line. Then you had 2 dance mixes. There was the Silk mix by Steve Silk Hurley and the Messed Around mix by some other guy. And finally, you had this B-side, which was called Don't Do It. And it's actually a really cool, moody track. There are no actual lyrics. There's just a vocal sample that says, "Don't put your finger on the button," over and over. And the music is really intense, much more so than anything on the album. And it's one of my favorite New Order B-sides. It's well worth getting this single for. I have this single as a 4-track CD and as a 6-track cassette and as a 6-track 12-inch too. So the 12-inch is over here. This was the lead-off single, so it was the first thing they released after Substance and the True Faith and Touched by the Hand of God singles. But this pressing that I have is just the cheap US Quest version of Ein Time. And one thing that I love about this, even though it's like really cheaply pressed, let me pull it out here real quick. One thing I really like about it is how the beats on the album form this cool pattern. And I don't know if you can see on the video, but it makes this like swirl pattern on the vinyl. I'm sure it was not intentional. I think the BPM of this song was just right to form that cool kind of spiral effect. So, I don't know. I think that's pretty neat. Anyway, after this, they released Round and Round. And the cover for that is yet another dichromat, this time of Louis XIV's The Sun King. Surely this was a reference to the party culture at the time. The various formats have different covers, though. I think the 7-inch has a pink cover, and some of the 12 inches are different. There was actually a whole separate series of releases called Round and Remix with exclusive mixes, and I have one of those here. I have the 3-inch Round and Remix CD, and for whatever reason, I do love me a CD3 single. I just think they're really cool. So look at this ridiculous lime color they have in here, and I don't know if you can see that, but it says Round and Remix on the actual release, and it's got 3 tracks on it, 3 more dance versions of Round and Round. But yeah, generally this single is going to have some mix of the 7-inch and 12-inch versions and various other 12-inch mixes. There's also a B-side called Best in Marsh that was literally the theme music for a British football program starring George Best and Rodney Marsh. It's kind of a little synth ditty of the sort that Steve and Gillian probably cooked up in their spare time. For those who don't know, those two were pretty successful in the 90s and the 2000s, scoring music for TV. They also provided, for instance, the original theme song to America's Most Wanted. So dig that up on YouTube if you want to check it out. Of course, all of those efforts culminated in them forming a band of sorts called The Other Two, when the other 2 folks in New Order, Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, were off doing solo projects, Revenge and Electronic, respectively. But that's a story for another time. The final single was meant to be Run 2. It kind of was Run 2. But as I said, John Rocky Mountain High Denver put the kibosh on it, but not before Factory pressed 20,000 or so copies of this bad boy. The cover is credited to Peter Saville after Bold, which is or was a popular laundry detergent in the United States. This is actually a really nice pressing. It's quite thick and heavy. Um, it has this cool gold inner sleeve. Um, Run 2 itself, the track, is essentially this Frankenstein monster of the original rock song on the album, plus some beats, as put together by Scott Litt, who was famous not so much for his dope dance tracks, but for producing REM. So, how he got this gig, I have no idea. But variant wise, there was only this limited edition 12 inch that has 4 tracks, and an even more limited edition 7 inch that was used just for promo purposes. I think the 7 inch came in 500 copies, if I'm not mistaken, and the 12 inch was 20,000 copies. But this 12 inch has 4 tracks. There are long and short versions of Run 2, and there are long and short versions of the B side, which is this thing that they called MTO. And the word on the street back in the day was that that was short for much too old, as kind of a reference to the lyrics in Fine Time, but of course no one knows for sure. It's sort of this ridiculous dance tune that basically samples the line, "You've got love technique" from Fine Time over and over. And it also uses this really cliche hip hop vocal sample that I think was originally from a Kid and Play track. But you'll know it when you hear it if you go out and listen to MTO. That vocal sample was all over dance tracks in the late 80s. It shows up on some Shriekback 12 inch that I have as well. It was just everywhere. So, yeah, the 7 inch, which I don't have, just had the short versions of these 2 tracks. But it's fun to own this because it was pretty rare, and I had to jump through some ridiculous hoops to get it way back in the day in the 90s. But the music, I have to say, on this release is not the greatest. One wonders why they didn't release a better track like Mr. Disco or Vanishing Point. Either of those could have been just remixed out the wing wang and could have been really successful. But then there were videos for these 3 singles as well. The only one that's really worth talking about is the video for Round and Round. It was the one that was the most stylish and unique, in my opinion. It just had headshots of these female models shot in black and white, intercut with brief shots of colorful things like marbles and flowers and scissors. So it was a really simple idea, but it stood out back in the days of videos that were just full of hairspray and twirling cod pieces, to paraphrase Frank Zappa. So it just struck one as being arty and cool and minimalist, and maybe just a little more of a classic video that would stand the test of time versus the other stuff that they were releasing. The videos for Fine Time and Run 2 weren't that great in my opinion. It was more of the hairspray and twirling codpiece kind of thing. But also, as I said, they did use that far superior single mix of Round and Round in the video, which helped it a lot. I remember even dubbing that off my TV, or off the VCR, I guess, onto cassette so I could listen to that mix because it was just way better than the crap that was on the album. There's one other track that's commonly associated with Technique that isn't on the album and wasn't on the singles. It was an instrumental called The Happy One, which sounds like it might have been a provisional title, but its only official release was on the Substance 1988 video collection, the VHS tape, on the interstitial clips between the regular videos. It played along to this animation of the leaves falling, the leaves from the True Faith album art. So many fans have tried to edit together the full song from all these little clips, but the problem is they don't quite fit together. So there is no official version of this song, The Happy One. Unofficially, though, Peter Hook once performed it live on TV for Tony Wilson's show The Other Side of Midnight. So he played the bass live along with the sequences, and they had the sequencers and basically brought all the equipment into the TV studio. And he did that reportedly because the rest of the band couldn't be bothered to show up, which completely tracks at the time. So this was around the time that they were starting to really get on each other's nerves. And after Technique, of course, they would go on hiatus for 4 years. So that performance of The Happy One remains the only full version of the song. And of course, you can find that on YouTube. So why do I love Technique? every album prior to this one was more or less ham-fisted in its blending of acoustic and electronic bits. And in my opinion, Technique was the first of their studio albums to get that blend right. So, for instance, Brotherhood, which came before this, had, acoustic songs on side A and electronic songs on side B. And I think that approach just didn't really work. On Technique, the blend is more or less consistent. You do have some more electronic songs, but, there's always Peter's bass to round that out. You have some acoustic songs, but sometimes they'll throw synth pads or whatever into that. So I think it works really well that way. I also really like that Peter's bass is very prominent. To me, his bass and Barney's voice define the New Order sound. So, for instance, their next album, Republic, which, it was a horrible, crappy album for a bunch of reasons, a lot of reasons. And maybe I should do an episode just panning Republic, listing all the things I hate about it. But one of the things I really hate about it is that you can only hear Peter's bass on like 2 tracks. And don't get me started about the so-called current incarnation of New Order. I mean, the fact is that it isn't really New Order without Peter Hook, period. I mean, they're just another New Order cover band. And, conversely, Peter's band isn't really New Order either without Barney's voice. Peter's nowhere near the singer that Barney is. Sorry, it's just true. So, in my mind, New Order hasn't existed at all since those two broke up. And really, it hasn't existed in my mind much at all beyond this album, Technique, for various reasons, we could get into. But this was New Order's last album with Factory Records also, before the label imploded. So it's kind of also the end of an era, the end of that association with Factory and all the madness that went on during that time. It was also, like I said, their last album before they took a 4-year hiatus to do the solo projects. After a decade of pumping out one classic album after another, year after year, 4 years seemed like forever as a New Order fan, waiting for them to come out with anything. It seemed like, maybe they were just done. And you didn't know that they were going to come back. They did, but like I said, the results were kind of lackluster. So this album is kind of a high water mark for me, and that's why I love it. It's funny and amazing to think about how far they came as a band from their days as Joy Division just 9 years prior to this. So this was released in 1989. Ian Curtis passed away in 1980. So in 9 years, they were at the forefront of this blend of dance and rock. And this was their peak fame and success, I would say. They covered a tremendous amount of ground in the 80s, and Technique is really the culmination of that. Not just for the songwriting and production, but again, for that overall summery vibe to it. It's very laid back, it's wistful, it's celebratory, it's poignant, it's all of those things. And you don't get that really from the lyrics, because Bernard Sumner is not Stephen Merritt of the Magnetic Fields, like I talked about in the last episode, where the lyrics are very concrete and literal. This is New Order, and the lyrics often are completely arbitrary. They make no sense, or maybe they only make sense within the 4 walls of a club or the 4 walls of your bedroom. But to me, this album perfectly captures the feeling of that last summer in high school before going off to the next big adventure, which is exactly what it was for me. That feeling of the last big hurrah, all the old gang, maybe some friendships are breaking up, your world is shifting around, but overall, feeling positive, if a little homesick. And listening to this album kind of brings me back to that sweet spot, that eye of the storm, and that's why I love it. So let's talk a little more about collecting Technique and the various singles. Like I said, all editions of this album have the same 9 songs, but there are a ton of different formats for each single. I think that's because this was that era with SoundScan when they counted different formats as the same release. So labels had an incentive to release 20 versions of each single in various markets and formats with slightly different track lists, because every sale counted toward the same overall single as far as sales and charts went. So it effectively gave them a way to pump up the numbers. They were trying to sell you the same single, 40 times, which is basically what they did to me because I obviously bought them all, or as many as I could. Round and Round in particular was just issued in a ton of formats. A lot of these had unique sleeve art or variations thereof or exclusive mixes and so on. And, a lot were only released in certain countries, so you could only get them in your country as an import. And, Discogs.com, for instance, lists at least 58 varieties of Round and Round. That's more varieties than Heinz when you think about it. So as a collector, it was a joy and a nightmare trying to train spot these things. And it was difficult because, the internet was still very young. Like I said, I was on the ceremony mailing list, which at the time was just a list serve. So for those of you who don't know, that was basically a mailing list over email. So we didn't have the web back in 1991, at least not in a way that you could easily use. They were still developing web browsers, and Tim Berners-Lee was still doing his thing with Mark Andreessen and so on. So that really wouldn't come around for a couple years. So there were no fan sites. Everything we knew about this band we were learning through the wonder that was listserv and through shared FTP archives and things like that. So just learning the full discography was a huge effort, a collaborative effort among people who, couldn't visualize this stuff. It was all just like text on an amber screen. So it's kind of hard to imagine that in this day and age when everything's just right there on the web. It was also a drag, having limited funds and having to shell out cash for the same tracks over and over because there was so much overlap between these singles. So you couldn't help but kind of feel abused in a bit or put upon as a fan of the band that they kept feeding you the same music and like, oh, we're going to put this one extra mix on here or this one extra bonus track on here to get you to buy this thing for the 7th time. But yeah, it was really hard to get my hands, especially on these CD singles back in the day. I did buy these way back in the early 90s, again, just by talking to people over the listserv. And it was difficult to do. And it's hard to believe now, in 2023, but in 1995, CD singles were in demand over the vinyl, at least as far as New Order was concerned, because there was a perception that the digital copies were perfect. And I know today that's like, heresy. A lot of people disagree with that. What about that analog warmth and tone? Yeah, well, okay, you audiophile, you. But that's I've said my piece about that over the years here, or over the months here, and I'm not going to go into it again. Go back to the first couple shows to hear my rant about that. But I'm telling you, that was the reality. There was a premium placed on the CD singles. So yeah, back in the day to get these, it was all done through email. You had to send a check through the mail and pray that the other guy followed through. And you really had no recourse, if it didn't work, they just took your money or whatever. So yeah, collecting these singles as a fan for New Order, and especially the Technique album where there were just so many formats, it was really, really difficult. And so in the early 2000s, there was talk of London Records, who, New Order went to after they left Factory. There was talk of London Records issuing some kind of comprehensive singles retrospective, similar to what Mute did for Depeche Mode. A collection of CD singles boxed up, and each CD would have the original artwork, and it would collect all the relevant mixes and B-sides from that release onto one disc. That's what they did for Depeche Mode. And at the time, there was more than ample demand in the New Order fan community that I was a part of, which had, several thousand members. I think London went so far as to release preliminary artwork for this project, which at various times they called Recycle and then Cardboard and Plastic. And to this day, you can still buy recycled t-shirts on eBay. I just saw one the other day. So yeah, anticipation built up for this in the early 2000s. But then London whiffed. What they did was they ended up releasing this box set called Retro that was a much more scaled back, simple 4 disc set that was really just yet another rehashed compilation. It was yet another cash grab. They merely repackaged the same tracks in a different order. And it was also pretty tone deaf because any super fan at the time already had all of these songs in MP3 form and could easily do the same kind of compilation with a playlist. Do y'all remember Winamp? That was a real thing at the time and it excelled at that kind of thing. So I'm not sure who exactly they were marketing Retro to because the fans wanted one thing. They wanted that comprehensive box set. And Retro was just a miss. And they never did release a complete singles collection for New Order. Steve Morris goes into this quite a bit in his memoir. I think of all the band members, he seemed the most jaded against the label for mortgaging the band's back catalog with these crappy compilations, and there were at least a dozen of them throughout the 90s and the 2000s because the band just wasn't writing material, and the London Records wanted to recoup their investment somehow. So they would just constantly reissue these compilations and throw a coat of paint on it, and people would buy the stuff. But, Steve may have been jaded against it, but he also did nothing to stop it and probably benefited from it. So, not that I'm blaming him. But in 2010, something pretty interesting happened. Some of you may know about this. A guy who went by the name 50 Pound Note started a blog out on Blogger called Recycle, Joy Division and New Order, The Factory Years. And he and another guy named Analog Loyalist sourced all the tracks from all of New Order and Joy Division's factory era singles. They cleaned up the audio, they normalized it, and they released it all online through Blogger. And this became the de facto box set that fans had been looking for. And amazingly, they even sourced all of the artwork for these singles and all the variations so that the enterprising fan could have all that and then could even print them up on cardstock if they wanted to make their own physical CD sleeves and make their own physical box set. And some people did that, and he posted images of people's really creative box sets that they were making from this material. And it was a tremendous amount of work, and all of it was, for a brief time, available totally for free on the interwebs. And naturally, the label eventually cottoned on to what was going on, and they issued a cease and desist. And Analog Loyalist, pardon me, had a sister blog called the New Order Archives that was similarly shut down. And what he was doing there was he was releasing old bootlegs. He was cleaning up bootlegs, long lost tracks, practice sessions, and so on, and had all the stuff tastefully annotated on the blog so you knew the context. And it was really interesting, but they shut that down as well. And I think that was in 2012 or so. So yeah, in a weird way, in the depths of the interwebs, the Recycle project did in fact come to fruition, but you just can't buy it today or easily find it. And I don't know where you can get it today, so don't bother asking me. I know that the original 2 blogs don't exist anymore. It's just one of those weird things that happened on the internet that you had to notice while it was there. Meanwhile, some of us are still hunting for some of the original rarities in physical form. And I don't know about vinyl these days, but CD prices are way, way down. And it's easier to collect them now than ever because so few people want them. And I have to think that's going to change in time because if cassettes could come back, of all things, with their crappy sound, so can CDs. So my opinion is get these things while you can because you never know. I mean, you can hop on eBay now and I could do a very quick search for, a lot of these CD singles that were really difficult to get back in the day. There's still a few that I don't have that I should probably pick up. But anyway, there you have it, kids. A classic album of summer, Technique by New Order. Blast it out an open window near you while the weather's hot. You've been listening to Stronger Than Reason, which you can catch on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm just a guy doing this for the fun of it. I don't see a dime from this. Quite the opposite, actually, because I keep investing in better recording equipment. But it gives me a kick when people engage with the channel, so I encourage you to leave a review or some comments. Hell, let's have a chat about this stuff. But I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.